think empires are built with swords and soldiers. Wrong. They're built with something way more powerful, fear. And in the ancient world, no one was scarier than Carthage. They were a city of rock-star merchants and sailors, so rich it made everyone jealous. But with all that money came dark rumors. Whispers of blood sacrifice, of generals being crucified just for losing, and punishments so insane they were designed to give their enemies nightmares for generations. But out of all these crazy stories, there's one that is just pure horror. It's the answer to one simple question. What happened to a traitor in Carthage? Legend says it wasn't a quick death. It was a public spectacle. The traitor was skinned alive and their raw, screaming body was thrown outside the city walls for the jackals to eat. It's a terrifying image that has stuck around for thousands of years. But here's the big question. It's a horrifying story, but is it true? Today, we're peeling back the layers of myth and propaganda to find out. Picture it. You're in the heart of Carthage, a city running on gold and paranoia, and a man is condemned. Not a foreigner, but one of them. A citizen, a soldier, maybe even a noble who betrayed the city. But there won't be a quiet execution. This is a performance. He's dragged into the main square. The sentence is announced. Not the sword, not the rope, the flayer's knife. And it begins. Piece by agonizing piece, his skin is peeled away from the muscle. His screams aren't silenced. They're a warning, a symphony of terror broadcast to anyone else thinking about betraying the city. But it's not over. His raw, living body is then dragged through the streets, past the massive city walls, and thrown into the dirt. Left for the sun, the flies, and the jackals circling overhead, drawn by the smell of blood. It's one of the most terrifying fates in all of ancient history. A punishment designed not just to end a life, but to turn a human being into meat. But did this actually happen? Or is this just a sick fantasy, a piece of next-level slander made up by Carthage's biggest enemies? To even understand how a story like this could exist, you have to get inside the Carthaginian mindset. This wasn't just some city. It was a massive maritime empire that dominated trade in the Western Mediterranean for centuries. Their ships carried timber, metals, and grain everywhere, making them insanely wealthy. But all that wealth came with a huge risk. Carthage was basically in a constant state of paranoia. Their whole world was built on secrets, trade routes, prices, weaknesses of their rivals. One leak could lose a fortune. One military betrayal could lose a war. So for them, loyalty wasn't just a nice idea. It was the bedrock of their entire civilization. And that made treason the worst crime imaginable. The government was an oligarchy, basically run by rich merchant families. But the real power, especially over the military, was a judicial body called the Tribunal of the 104. This court was set up to keep generals and officials in line, and they were brutal. A general who lost a battle didn't just get fired. He could be fined into bankruptcy or even crucified. The message was simple. The state is everything, and no one is above its judgment. Treason in the ancient world was always a capital offense. The Romans, for example, would throw traitors off a cliff. We know the Carthaginians were just as harsh. Crucifixion was a known penalty for the lowest criminals and, tellingly, failed generals. During the Mercenary War in the 3rd century BCE, a bloody uprising of Carthage's own hired soldiers, betrayal was met with pure savagery. Captured rebel leaders were crucified in full view of their own armies. Some prisoners were even trampled to death by war elephants. In one insane episode, a group of Carthaginian prisoners had their hands cut off and their legs broken before being thrown into a pit to die. In a world with stakes this high, the idea of being flayed alive doesn't seem completely impossible. Flaying was a known, though rare, form of execution. The Assyrian Empire did it centuries earlier, skinning rebellious kings and nailing their hides to the city walls as a warning. It was pure psychological warfare. The legend of a traitor being skinned and left for the Jackals fits this logic perfectly. It combines extreme pain with public humiliation. To be left for wild animals meant you were denied a proper burial, a huge deal in the ancient world. It was a punishment that destroyed you in this life and the next. So, the context is there. Carthage was a state that dealt with failure and betrayal with extreme prejudice. But context isn't proof. The question is still, did they actually do this? This is where our investigation hits a massive wall. Almost everything we know about Carthage was written by their enemies. The great library of Carthage, which held their side of the story, was burned to the ground when Rome destroyed the city in 146 BCE. What we have left are the accounts of Greek and, most importantly, Roman historians. And they were not neutral. They were building a narrative. Let's look at the accusers, the Romans. For over 100 years, Rome and Carthage fought a series of massive conflicts called the Punic Wars. To justify the insane cost of these wars, Roman writers launched a brilliant propaganda campaign. Historians like Livy painted the Carthaginians as deceitful, greedy, and cruel. This became a stereotype. In Rome, calling something Punic faith was an insult, meaning treachery. The most famous story of Carthaginian cruelty is the legend of Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman general captured during the First Punic War. Roman tradition says the Carthaginians sent him to Rome to negotiate a prisoner exchange. But Regulus, being an honorable Roman, told the Senate to refuse the deal and keep fighting. He then returned to Carthage, knowing it was a death sentence. What the Romans claim happened next is nightmare fuel. They say his eyelids were cut off and he was forced to stare into the sun. Another version claims he was put in a narrow wooden box filled with sharp spikes and left to die. This story became a legend in Rome, a perfect example of Roman honor versus Carthaginian barbarity. But here's the catch. The earliest and most reliable historian, the Greek writer Polybius, never mentions the torture. Later Roman writers, adding details centuries after the event, are the ones who give us the goriest accounts. Many modern historians now think the story was either completely made up or wildly exaggerated, possibly to justify the torture of Carthaginian prisoners by Regulus's own wife. This is classic atrocity propaganda. This brings us back to our skinned traitor. If the Carthaginians were routinely flaying people, why is it never mentioned by the major historians? Livy and Polybius wrote about crucifixions and the horrors of the Mercenary War. But on the specific punishment of being skinned alive, the main sources are silent. This is what's called an argument from silence. It's not definitive proof, but it's a huge red flag. A punishment this dramatic would have been a gift to Roman propaganda writers. The fact that they didn't use it suggests they didn't know about it, probably because it wasn't a real state-sanctioned practice. So, if the story isn't in the history books, where did it come from? It could be folklore, a rumor that just grew out of Carthage's reputation for being harsh. Or it could be a later invention, attaching a horrifying practice from another barbaric empire, like the Assyrians, onto their greatest enemy. We are deep in the murky waters of history, where fact and fiction get messy. We've seen how propaganda can literally rewrite the past. If you're finding this investigation as insane as I am, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. It's the best way to support our journey into the past. Now, let's turn to the hard evidence. Archaeology. When we switch from biased Roman texts to the actual ground in Carthage, the picture gets way more interesting. Excavations have confirmed that Carthage was a place of brutal realities, just maybe not the ones in the legends. The most controversial site in Carthage is the Tophet. This is a sacred burial ground with thousands of small urns dating from the city's founding until its destruction. Inside these urns are the cremated ashes of infants, some just a few weeks old, and young animals. For decades, the leading theory, backed up by ancient writers like Diodorus Siculus, was that the Tophet was a site of mass child sacrifice. He wrote a terrifying account of a giant bronze statue with outstretched hands that would drop children into a pit of fire. But today, that interpretation is fiercely debated. Some scholars argue the Tophet was just a special cemetery for infants and stillborns who died of natural causes, which was incredibly common back then. They think grieving parents gave their children a sacred burial to put them under the protection of the gods. The scientific debate is still active, with studies on the remains giving conflicting results. Whether it was a sacrificial site or a special cemetery, the Tophet confirms one thing. The Romans weren't just making things up. They were likely distorting and exaggerating practices they found genuinely horrifying. So what about our flaying victim? We have texts confirming crucifixion was used by Carthaginians, and archaeology backs this up. It was a common, brutal execution method all over the Mediterranean. But for flaying, there is zero archaeological evidence. No special flaying knives, no carvings of the act like we see with the Assyrians, and no bodies that show any signs of this fate. When you put all the evidence together, a verdict starts to take shape. On one hand, Carthage was undeniably severe. A tribunal could sentence its own generals to death. They fought wars with incredible brutality, and they maintained the Tophet, a site that was proof of their barbarism to their enemies. On the other hand, the specific legend of a traitor being skinned alive is hanging by a thread. It's not in the main historical sources, there's no archaeological proof, and it smells exactly like propaganda, just like the story of Regulus's torture. So what's the final verdict? The story of a Carthaginian traitor being skinned alive and left for the Jackals is almost certainly a myth. It's not history. It's a horror story. It's a powerful piece of black propaganda that has echoed through time. While Carthaginians were definitely capable of extreme cruelty, as shown by their use of crucifixion and their actions in the Mercenary War, this specific punishment seems to be a total fabrication. It's a legend born from a kernel of truth, Carthage's harsh justice, but blown up by their enemies to make them look like monsters. It was a story designed to justify Rome's own ambition to wipe them off the map. The fact that this story survived tells us less about Carthage and more about how history itself works. History is a narrative, and narratives are shaped by the winners. For centuries, the only storytellers were the Romans, who completely destroyed their rivals. In the ruins of Carthage, Rome was free to write whatever story it wanted, defining its dead enemy forever. They created an image of a dark, cruel, child-sacrificing empire, the perfect villain for their own story of honor and justice. The legend of the flayed traitor is a chilling reminder that the best lies are built around a grain of truth. It proves that a gruesome story can capture our imagination and live on, long after the facts have turned to dust. It forces us to be skeptics, to always ask who is telling the story and why. Because history is full of ghosts, and a lot of them were created by the ink of the victors. What do you think? Is the silence from the historians the key, or does Carthage's known brutality make a legend like this plausible? Drop your verdict in the comments below, and if you want to keep digging up the truth behind history's darkest stories, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Thanks for watching.